Any viewer with more than a casual interest in horror films can tell you the genre term horror merely scratches the surface. There are dozens of subgenres to categorize the many varied delights of sickos, dwellers of the dark, bloodlusted cinephiles, or just people who like a good scare.
Jesus, this place is packed tonight, man.
We had a run in the mass murder section.
Slashers, vampire flicks, zombie apocalypses, haunted house movies, creature features, torture porn and splatter, body horror, psychological horror, cosmic horror, and on and on. And in recent years, we have a greater mainstream awareness and proliferation of what might be called racial horror. I don't love the title, but whatever. That isn't to say that race was absent from classic horror cinema. The book and documentary Horror Noir makes a decent argument that even when black people weren't there, we were there. But it feels like there's a stream of films coming in the wake of the cultural tidal wave made by Jordan Peele's Get Out. These are now big budget films and TV series that translate anxieties surrounding race into the explicit text of the horror film. In the widening landscape of this subgenre, I can't help but notice a curious and disturbing trend. Certain images recurring, shadows from America's shameful past, enduring legacies of what was once arguably the most popular theatrical form in the country. One that entertained swaths of audiences from presidents to celebrated authors to regular working class folks. A forgotten, dark art. Minstrelsy. The dreaded, yikes-inducing blackface. When those performances and imagery largely disappeared from public spaces, the ideas were left to rot in the cultural psyche. Now they've crept their way back on screen, taking even more sinister forms. So, what's going on? Is this minstrel horror? I have some thoughts. Let's talk about it. Blackface minstrelsy was a huge part of American culture. In some ways, it feels like we can't escape it, and not entirely from a lack of trying. Its dark legacy haunts Hollywood and the performing arts to this day, stalking it like a vengeful killer dressed as the Gordon Fisherman in a film called I Know What You Did Last Antebellum. It's so enduring that now in the 21st century, those old submerged images of cultural detritus have floated back up to the surface, although not at all with the reverence or sentimentality of when they were first created. In the hands of, mostly, black creators, they're now much darker. And I'm specifically thinking about 3 examples of what I'm tentatively calling minstrel horror, all of which premiered within a 3 or 4 year span. First, we have HBO's short-lived sci-fi horror fantasy epic, Lovecraft Country. The show overall follows the nerdy Korean War vet Atticus, nicknamed Tick, as he's confronted with the magical origins of a dangerous family inheritance, and must overcome all sorts of mythical, supernatural, and super racist powerful forces. In one episode, Tick's young cousin Dee has a run-in with a racist warlock cop who places a disgusting curse on her. For the rest of the episode, Dee is relentlessly pursued by demonic entities, 2 frightening, dancing little girls named Topsy and Bopsy.
Stop that knocking at the door. That means stop that knocking, stop that knocking, stop that knocking, stop that knocking. You ain't better stop that knocking at the door.
In another story, we have the first season of the Prime Video series Them, which depicts the Emery family and their horrific move into the hostile white neighborhood of Compton in the 1950s. As the family settles into their new suburban home, they're not only antagonized by racist neighbors, but each member of the family is haunted by a different malignant racist spirit. The father draws the focus of an unnerving entity only known as the Tap Dance Man.
What you gonna do? What you gonna do? What you gonna do?
Finally, I watched the 2018 sequel anthology film Tales from the Hood 2. A group of teens who resemble those certain kinds of interracial couples that post really upsetting TikToks break into a museum of blackface memorabilia.
It's a whipping post. You know, like where if I was your master,
I'd tie up and punish your pretty black ass for not obeying my every perverted desire.
However, the group soon encounters some Night at the Museum style hijinks, but instead of statues of like Freddie Mercury and Robin Williams coming to life, you get a freaky killer doll who grows human-sized, whips people to death, and does other things. Those summaries might sound random and like a lot, and that's because they are. Each of these interestingly come from anthology type creations or otherwise very ambitious stories that try to cover a lot of ground in about 10 episodes. The minstrel demon becomes just one of many things tormenting the characters in these works, but brief or partial as their evil presences may be, they leave an impact. These characters are rooted in a long and very well documented cultural history. So let's take a look at exactly what's being referenced. Just a heads up, I want most of this video to be informational, and to do that, my go-to mode is to get kind of academic about it, but like the information here is all up. So it's a bit of a struggle, but just bear with me, please. All my research tells me any brief description of blackface minstrelsy is bound to be overly simplistic and maybe a little reductive in terms of its impact. The cultural significance and meaning of blackface minstrelsy is a complex history. There are a lot of ingredients in that stew, and while some flavors absolutely dominate the dish, you can taste some others if you dip the spoon deep enough. Does that metaphor make sense? This is why you shouldn't write when you're hungry. At its core, blackface minstrelsy was an art form that involved performers imitating black people through songs, dances, and comedy routines. The actors traditionally used the ash from burned cork or shoe polish or grease paint to blacken up, darkening their skin and exaggerating their features to create clown-like faces that resembled black people, all in the name of comedy.
Very funny, bitch. Very funny!
So that's the what. Truthfully, the why is a bit stickier. Most obviously, it was a form of ridiculing black people, painting them as foolish, incompetent, lazy, and either real happy or at least chill about being second-class citizens. As Professor Eric Lott argues in his influential book, Love and Theft, blackface minstrelsy was a practice deeply rooted in the exploitation, theft, and consumer obsession, love, that defined material relations of American chattel slavery. A demonstration of power wherein white people could extract another people's culture and their very identity and resell it as accessible entertainment for the masses. It's an appendage of white supremacy that recast black people as enjoying their place in that awful hierarchy. Besides fostering racial enmity, some scholars like Lott and W.T. Lehman assert evidence that minstrelsy also likely provided an outlet for racial transgression as an adaptation of European traditions of wearing disguises and acting a damn fool. In this light, blackface minstrelsy could serve as a form of masking that allowed working class white people to publicly make anti-capitalist critique by filtering them through ridiculed characters, at least some of the time. It also gave white northerners an outlet to participate in the song and dance cultures of black folk, because black people are fly as hell and we all know it, but letting them do it in a socially acceptable form given the context of a violently racist culture that still legally regarded some human beings as property, chattel. Many going so far as to literally study black performers to try and cop the style. From lower class white artists, there was also an element of ignorant bohemian fascination with blackness, black masculinity, and black bodies. The original hipsters taken it entirely too far. And not to mention the black actors and entertainers who also donned the burnt cork and participated in minstrelsy, most notably people like Lincoln Perry. Perry is sometimes referred to as Hollywood's first black movie star, under his much more recognizable character name, Stepin Fetchit. Stepin Fetchit was lazy, shiftless, and at least seemingly dumb. All these uncreative images of black folk, and he performed it on the biggest stage in the world. the silver screen. Perry hustled his way to stardom, building his bank account to millionaire status, while catching the ire of many black intellectuals all over the country. There's definitely an uncomfortable ambivalence when considering this side of blackface minstrelsy. On the one hand, for a check continues to be one of the surefire ways to collectively piss off entire segments of the black community at once. On the other, black entertainers had little opportunity at the time to express their talents on as big a stage as minstrelsy afforded them. To be generous, a lot of these people weren't merely on a morally bankrupt money play. They were true artists who wanted to touch huge audiences in a vaudevillian style, and minstrelsy could be the available vehicle to make that happen, at least for a time. I mean, if them unfunny cornballs down the street are making a biggity bag off your image, I guess you might as well exploit yourself. I don't think I could go through with that personally, but I can try to empathize. People were generally doing a whole different type of calculus to survive back then, so I try to keep that in mind. But doesn't make it any easier to look at. As I said, it's complicated. Like a nasty fart that seems to emanate from several areas of a room at once, the origins and intentions behind blackface minstrelsy are diffuse and layered, but at the end of the day, it all just really stinks. Transforming into black people tethereds wasn't just a passing fad or a fringe pastime. This ain't the chicken noodle soup. Or is it? After being popularized by people such as performer T.D. Rice and songwriter Stephen Foster, minstrelsy exploded in popularity in the mid-1800s and remained relevant for generations going well into the 1900s. T.D. Rice's infamous character first premiered in 1830 and became the name which embodied the totality of the racial apartheid system in the southern United States that ended officially in 1965. The system we know as Jim Crow laws.
Every time I wheel about a Jim Crow, I went down to the river. I didn't mean to stay, but there I saw so many gals I couldn't get away. Wheel about and turn about and do just so. Every time I wheel about a Jim Crow. Give me back my clothes, please.
And it was pervasive. The tentacles of blackface minstrelsy stretch far beyond its heyday into modern times through cultural artifacts. By the way, y'all like ice cream? In the 1920s, dessert company Good Humor revolutionized the ice cream industry by putting their brand on the road on a fleet of white pickup trucks, an innovation that solidified the image of frozen cow titty milk on wheels for the next century. However, they and the companies who followed their lead ran into an interesting issue. See, before Good Humor started passing out sticks of ice cream through a truck window, most vendors rolled their confections around a downtown area in hand carts. They'd yell and ring handbells to get people's attention in the hopes they'd want to stop and buy candy from the sweaty shouting man. With the advent of ice cream trucks, they needed a sound to attract customers that could be heard over a loud truck engine, but preferably something more pleasant than a car horn. They took the music boxes that you'd hear in old-timey ice cream parlors and modified them, allowing the trucks to start playing the iconic music that has since become synonymous with summer. These were short jingles or snippets of old songs in the public domain. The draw was finding something cheap, catchy, and memorable. One of these well-known songs happened to be based on an old Irish melody called The Old Rose Tree, which had previously become much more popular and widely known in American culture when it was adapted into minstrel shows. People loved the minstrel music so much they kept adapting it, sometimes for better, like with Turkey in the Straw, and sometimes for much worse.
Damn.
And if you weren't really into that particular oppression bop, there were other songs they'd play like Camptown Races, Oh Susanna, Jimmy Crack Corn, Dixie, all of which were also blackface minstrel songs.
Damn.
Look, the Mr. Softy song washes all the other ice cream songs anyway, so it's cool. And it doesn't stop there. Do you know why the most famous cartoon mouse and cartoon bunny wear those white gloves? It's an animation hack that basically made the process easier, cleverly utilized because audiences at the time would already recognize the white gloves as something visually familiar and tonally consistent with edgy cartoons. Minstrelsy.
Damn!
Have you heard of these products? Have you heard of these products? Aunt Jemima, the cream of wheat nigga? Minstrelsy.
Damn!
The first major film presented with sound sync to it that propelled the film industry out of the silent era was 1927's The Jazz Singer. Audiences were experiencing talking films for the first time, and what they heard was minstrel music. Sung by Al Waterhead Jolson, the preeminent performer of his time and prolific blackface artist. This is how Jolson was remembered by popular Hollywood eating programs in the 1960s.
Al Jolson was called the world's greatest entertainer. There may never be another performer to claim this title.
Swanee, how I love you, my dear old Swanee.
Very funny, bitch. Very funny!
And before anyone gets into the silly notion of you can't judge the past by modern standards, that was just acceptable at the time. Here's a quote from someone remarking on minstrelsy at the time of its peak popularity. This writer describes blackface performers as the filthy scum of white society, who have stolen from us a complexion denied to them by nature, in which to make money, and pander to the corrupt taste of their white fellow citizens. That was Frederick Douglass, Black History Month staple, freedman, and 4C icon, writing for his publication, The North Star, in October 27. 1848. The ways that modern examples of minstrel horror comment on this history becomes a lot more interesting in the details. Rather than transforming the general act of blacking up, they are specific in their reinterpretations. Tales from the Hood 2, them, and Lovecraft Country all draw on some canonical stereotypes within historical blackface minstrelsy. Minstrel classics, if you will. Many minstrel acts were presented as variety shows, which established a roster of different replicable characters. Let's call it the minstrel cinematic universe. There were docile enslaved characters on a plantation called Sambos or kind of like T.D. Rice's Jim Crow. There were jester and comedy duos like Tambo and Bones, and of course we had the minstrel archetype you may be most familiar with, the matronly caretaker, Mammy, who has her own layered history outside the minstrel show, but let's stay focused. They all usually had particular roles and gimmicks in these routines that added a level of familiarity for audiences watching performances from different minstrel troupes. The two demons antagonizing the characters of Lovecraft Country draw on the pickaninny stereotype. Wild-haired, raggedy, and mischievous children who run around a plantation and sometimes die in goofy, supposedly comical ways. You could find pickaninnies everywhere in racist memorabilia, including illustrator E.W. Kemble's vexingly popular 1898 children's teaching tool, A Alphabet, which featured hilarious illustrations like these.
Very funny!
Lovecraft Country specifically references the archetypal pickaninny character Topsy from Uncle Tom's Cabin. This was Harriet Beecher Stowe's well-intentioned attempt at anti-racist literature. In it, Topsy is described as, quote, the most woebegone little darky ever seen. She is a belittled, beleaguered child whose suffering goes largely ignored. Characteristics that folded into a stereotype of black children being little more than dehumanized comedic set dressing who don't feel pain. This is largely the character Dee's experience in the episode of Lovecraft Country where she encounters Topsy and Bopsy. In the episode named Jigabobo, Dee mourns the brutal murder of her friend. Yet no one seems concerned enough about her pain. Dee is left to grieve and melt down all alone, leaving her to the clutches of an evil sorcerer policeman who curses Dee for his own vendetta against her family. For the rest of the episode, Dee flees from and fights off these classic depictions of pickaninnies, complete with potato sack dresses and a flurry of pigtails. The horror twist comes with their bloody grins, yellow eyes, and deadly sharp nails as they relentlessly chase down Dee in a jigging, twistedly playful dance. And I know these are supposed to be scary, but they kind of hitting that hoe. The Gollywog is a blackface minstrel doll caricature based on the Negro minstrel dolls once most popular with European and American children in the 1800s. The Gollywog as we know it now got its name and standard appearance when author-illustrator Florence Kate Upton brought a version of the popular doll to life in her 1873 book, The Adventures of Two Dutch Dolls. The Golly's appearance drew on a familiar image characterized by its jet black skin, bright red lips, wide eyes, and wild hair, wearing traditionally primary colored minstrel clothing. They would often show up in imaginings of Toyland stories like Raggedy Ann or Raggedy Andy dolls. And although the Gollywog as presented in Upton's original story was a friendly, helpful character, and other authors got a hold of it, they imbued the Gollywog with much of the racist derision and mockery of the real-life blackface minstrels. Tales from the Hood 2 brings that history into a segment called
Good Golly.
The white girl in this group of teens obsessively seeks out a Golly as they remind her of the doll she loved as a child. She's the one leading their break-in of the museum. Her fetishization in relationship to a narrow idea of blackness is supposed to be reflected in the interracial couple's cringy antics and embodied in the monstrousness of the reanimated Gollywog. The racist history of the doll comes back to bite them, literally. And he, and then she... you know what? Let's move on. The Tap Dance Man. Okay, one last thing, because this movie is wild. There's a framing device storyline involving a racist white man trying to program a ruthless police robot, but instead of teaching the robot to be a cop by like having it tear gas people on the Vine Street Expressway or shoot dogs, they make it listen to the devil tell a bunch of stories. I'll spare you the details, but like, the ghost of Emmett Till is involved. It's not great.
Who the hell are you?
Respect the sacrifice.
You're the four little girls.
Yes, sir. And Emmett standing up and dying like he did helped us get voting rights.
And I'm pretty sure you know who that is.
Dr. King.
No, stop!
We're moving on. The Tap Dance Man in them is somewhat of a take on the character Zip Coon. Zip Coon was kind of a counterpart to Jim Crow or the typical Zambo character. The Sambo was this like carefree, simple fool and sometimes trickster figure of the southern plantation. Zip Coon, on the other hand, was no less ignorant, but wandered the northern urban centers, putting on the affect of upper class society and humorously failing at it, like using common words incorrectly. He tried to fit in, but his malapropic speech and misunderstanding of white social norms always gives him away. His character was primarily expressed through song and dance. Remember the ice cream song I mentioned? That was a Zip Coon song. Zip Coon was one of the peaks of cruel mockery within minstrelsy, that black people could only entertain and never actually be part of a society, or at least a multi-ethnic society at large that was bound to respect them, freed or not. Similarly, the father in the series Them encounters the demonic Zip Coon archetype as he attempts to establish himself in a lily white professional environment. He starts working at a new job in a new town as the only black engineer at an all-white firm. Racist microaggressions abound and plenty of macroaggressions. This is just aggressive.
Over there, I
am so sorry to bother you, ma'am. But today's my first day and I'm looking for directions to the
kitchen's on the 3rd floor, past accounting, can't miss it. Tanner, please.
And here comes the Tap Dance Man, a cravenly performative caricature mocking the father in his lowest moments. He's there to exemplify the father's failure to assimilate, molding him as a Zip Coon figure in his own life. Like a typical minstrel, the Tap Dance Man presents as jovial and constantly laughing and smiling, yet withholding something much darker.
Show you right.
The examples of minstrel horror I'm focusing on draw on old symbols to elicit fresh fear. But what are the stories being told? What do we get out of telling them and reproducing this insulting imagery? And what might these haunted symbols take from us? In 1963, James Baldwin published his seminal book of essays, The Fire Next Time. The volume begins with a heartfelt address to his nephew, whom Baldwin lovingly compares to the boy's grandfather. Baldwin admits Your grandfather had a terrible life. He was defeated long before he died because at the bottom of his heart, he really believed what the white people said about him. You can only be destroyed by believing that you really are what the white world calls a nigger. I tell you this because I love you, and please don't you ever forget it. A profound piece of advice from the acclaimed writer and intellectual, advice which can also read a lot like a warning. About 4 decades later, in the year 2000, writer-director Spike Lee released his 13th feature film and kicked off the new millennium by giving a hefty side-eye toward the past. Titled Bamboozled, this was his darkly funny, incendiary satire aimed at the entertainment industry's strained relationship with black folks. The plot hinges around a black TV writer named Pierre Delacroix, nicknamed De La, who struggles to get support from his very white network and his very racist boss. His biggest hurdle being that all his ideas focus on purely positive depictions of black people. In a supreme act of frustration, self-sabotage, and gall, De La pitches one last show.
My show that I'm pitching is about promoting racial healing.
Okay, no. What's the name of the show? We need something that we could sell.
Man Tan, the new millennium minstrel show.
And they go through with it. Thinking once audiences are rightly horrified by a resurrected minstrel show, Pierre will be released from his contract and the network may be so embarrassed as to go off the air entirely.
The show will be so negative, so offensive and racist. Hence, I will prove my point.
However, things don't go according to plan. While the audience is apprehensive at first, in true Mel Brooks fashion, the show becomes a hit. Even De La himself gets swept up in his own ill-gotten success. It quickly becomes clear that Delacroix's fatal flaw isn't just miscalculation, but a brazen moment of hubris and gross underestimation of the American public's power of self-delusion. De La and his loyal-to-a-fault assistant Sloan think just seeing the images reproduced will allow an audience to get it, to understand the line crossed by celebrating blackface minstrelsy. They think they can harness a tool of white supremacy, the minstrel show, and wield it against the culture that descended from it, using satire and entertainment as a catalyst for change. The thing is, they're incompetent. De La and Sloan trifle with forces they don't quite understand.
Even though the material will be somewhat offensive, there is definitely a social message that we should focus.
De La doesn't even respect the medium he works in and repeatedly refers to television as the idiot box. De La doesn't realize, or at least doesn't appreciate, how the body of an entertainment industry rooted in white supremacy would be inoculated against its own viral makeup. Whatever current in American culture that made these images entertaining still runs through. Simply leaning into the pure entertainment elements of minstrelsy will never so clearly reveal the monstrousness of it. Bamboozled features a particular prop that really captures the bewitching power and hauntedness of symbols, a minstrel coin bank that Sloan gifts to De La.
And what do we call this thing?
It is called a jolly nigger bank. Ain't that something?
In a straight up eerie scene toward the back half of the film, De La reaches a low point and transfixes on the bank. As the walls are closing in on De La and this twisted production starts ratcheting up to an inevitable tragedy, De La's psyche is left vulnerable to the dark forces surrounding him. And then something miraculous happens, or rather, an omen happens. Suddenly, the bank moves by itself. The self-animating bank moves more and more furiously as if possessed, crazed. The haunted symbols that granted De La success have consumed him, and he officially loses control, if he ever truly held it. Bamboozled tells us that these dark images, these symbols, hold a weight and a power that need to be reckoned with, understood, and dealt with, or else they might wrestle themselves from what we compel them to do. Potentially take on a life of their own.
Stop it! Stop it! Stop it!
Here's a question. When does a thing stop being effective satire and just becomes a reinforcement of the thing being satirized? It's nuanced, and satirists have been haunted by the consequences of that question for a long time. Your story might be really clever and in your view showcases all the things wrong with your subject, and depending on the way you tell it, could risk being completely misunderstood and ultimately co-opted. Spike Lee often escapes this pitfall through a certain quality of his films that he's often criticized for, which is a supreme lack of subtlety. Critics have lamented for a long time that Spike's storytelling instincts are way too on the nose. Well, media literacy for general audiences is kind of in its flop era. Competent analysis, we don't know her. Miss Cognitive Dissonance, though, she's eaten. So I've noticed that if something isn't surgically attached to people's noses, they'll often do anything they can to avoid seeing the harmful aspects of their own deeply held beliefs or ingrained behaviors. For Bamboozled, the film literally opens on a definition of satire, and you know what? I don't think anybody misunderstands that film's view on blackface minstrelsy.
He bagged us over the head. He even put the definition of satire at the beginning of the movie. They did say that.
Although, even here, that's not entirely true, as some academics are less convinced Bamboozled's narrative satire is entirely successful without metatextual knowledge from the audience. I guess you can't please everybody. So how does Minstrel Horror deal with this problem? For one, the blackface minstrel as a horror monster kinda does an Uno reverse on the original representation of minstrelsy by shifting the perspective of its audience. Whereas the blackface minstrel granted entertainment for the white gazing subject, for black folk, these images were always immediately more contentious. Again, I'll refer to my friend Frederick Douglass.
They not like us. I took a pocket to pull. Hey, they not like us. I took a pocket to pay. Take a pull. Hey.
The blackface minstrel as a horror figure simply writes into text what was previously subtext, for most black viewers at least, by speaking an emotional truth. Minstrelsy was already a haunted mirror that refused to show true reflections of black people. We were like theatrical or cinematic vampires, or if you go by some infamous illustrations, literally vampires. Black people disappear into a vacuum of meaning, and out pop black bodies alienated from their personhood and possessed by collective fear. Casting a minstrel character as literal evil just makes this connection more explicit. And the genre of horror makes a lot of sense too. I can see the impulse to take this potent source of ire, pain, and shame and render it through our most relevant cultural form where we deal with those kinds of negative emotions. We're anxious about what kids get up to when we're not watching? We make a horror story. We're uncomfortable with motherhood and taboo feelings of hating our own children? Horror movies. Fear of disease outbreak, the Red Scare, general fear of women's sexuality, horror story, horror stories. I will point out that not everybody is cool with that process. Just taking a litmus test of social media and the revitalized discourse around Lovecraft Country that pops up every so often, and anecdotally in my own conversations with family and friends, it seems like most black people do not mess with these shows, nor are interested in anything you could call minstrel horror. For example, Angelica Bastian had this to say about the show Them.
Them, showrun and created by Little Marvin and executive produced by Lena Waithe, isn't just rote, fragrantly biting the aesthetics of other filmmakers. It isn't just morally bankrupt. It isn't just grating in its empty platitudes and kiddie pool deep proclamations. I am comfortable calling it one of the most anti-black pieces of pop culture I've seen in the last few years. One that left me spent after the grueling process of watching its virulent imagery. Them primarily feels empty during the first half of its run, but episode 5, Covenant 1, which is notably directed by the show's only black director, Zola's Janixa Bravo, turns the show from a grating, hollow depiction of blackness in America to one that revels in degrading its black characters in a way that left me questioning both the black creators involved and the studio system that is eager for this kind of work.
I think this take is maybe too uncharitable, a bit too harsh, but it's not like she's coming out of nowhere. While I tend to believe the creators of these shows and movies when they discuss how their projects come from an honest place, wanting to be raw in a way that people feel seen, it did not have the effect they wanted on a lot of viewers. Some of the content in the shows are straight up traumatizing. In them in particular, the trauma wasn't even really the minstrel elements. I'm aligned with Bastien here. It was the relentless victimization. At least they often got to fight back in Lovecraft Country, and Tales from the Hood 2 is treated as a farce and a fable, kinda.
Welcome to hell, motherfucker!
Them was just a lot. Like, Cat in the Bag was so awful. The black and white episodes so gratuitous. Just, it's a very dark story, y'all. Be careful watching that show if you choose to. And I can't say Tales from the Hood's story is super successful in its satire coming across the way it probably intended. The imagery feels like it's in the driver's seat here more often than not. The team clearly had a point. The curator character all but spells it out.
For God's sakes, it's a doll.
It's a tool, an instrument of manipulation that kills the spirit of who we really are by presenting the lie others wish to see. Message!
But what feeling is this supposed to induce? Laughter? Disgust? A little bit of both, I guess? And is camp really the appropriate tone and aesthetic for the subject matter? For this particular message they're trying to get across? I'll hand it to Lovecraft Country. It made big swings and took a lot of risks. It was an ambitious, messy show with no chill that was problematic, yet usually at the end of the day, pretty entertaining more often than not. I'm sorry, but racist cops getting redacted by a ravenous magical pig monster will never not be fun to watch.
Are you not entertained? Are you not entertained?
Beautiful. But how do these characters born on the comedy stage live up to being potential horror icons? Like, I think it's fair to ask whether the horror even works, and if so, how? What supposedly makes these images so potentially horrifying? In some ways, there's a recognizable hauntedness to blackface minstrelsy present in its very origins. The Atlantic Monthly published a write-up of T.D. Rice's debut blackface performance as Jim Crow, referring to its effect as an extraordinary apparition. They build on an idea that artists conjure up these characters to present them on stage. And it's just damn creepy. I mean, let's just get down to it. The look is grotesque and unsettling. Contorted features, the imitation not of someone's beautiful dark skin, but something resembling a shadow with bright overdrawn lips. I don't know what to tell you, but we don't really look like that. The fear isn't merely skin deep, so let's look under the surface. For one, when you open the Pandora's box to the history of blackface minstrelsy, you will see things that can't be unseen. There's a creepiness to its sheer ubiquity. It was on everything.
Everything. Everything. Everything.
All over popular culture, it touched everything from film to everyday items, posters, tchotchkes, the wallpaper of life, the things that litter De La's office or the museum's entire catalog. Cream of wheat cookie jars, cartoons, a Boy George video in 1980 something? Just why? Why is this happening? Do you really want to hurt me, George? You could probably guess this, but the economics behind minstrelsy are pretty horrifying too. Among all these other issues, there's a sad story of how blackface minstrelsy rendered yet another disappointing failure in class solidarity in the US. In Love and Theft, Professor Eric Lott traces the histories of blackface minstrelsy with a Marxist lens. He argues that the social commentary and targeted ridicule of minstrelsy helped solidify a socio-economic and political divide between working-class white folks and free working-class black people. The Black Mask offered a way to play with the collective fears of a degraded and threatening and male other, while at the same time maintaining some symbolic control over them. There's an imbalance in the performance of minstrelsy, an underlying tension from a lopsided power relationship at play, underneath all the shucking and jiving. It's all just very exploitative, isn't it? And even beyond a failure to appreciate our things and not make it weird, the transaction going on in blackface performances is corrupted at the root. Even if partially based on some twisted reverence of black culture, the reality is there were and are very few appropriate, unproblematic outlets for that in a thoroughly racist macro culture built on the tools of capitalism. Cross-cultural appropriation very easily takes on a democratized form of exploitation that encourages extraction, alienation, and theft of an underclass so that it may be repackaged and resold at a higher value. Overall, what I'm saying is there's fertile ground here. If you're wondering how easy it would be to translate these images to the language of horror,
Look at the material.
You should be going home
You
anyway.
can be the judge of it.
each example of minstrel horror uses their specific minstrel archetype to tell a particular story. But the themes of falseness, dual identity, and possession or uncontrolled transformation repeat. I'm drawn to a singular image that is a feature highlighted in every single example and is a potent encapsulation of all those themes. That is the big painted smile. Repeatedly, we see the focus on the smile in these works of horror. Even Bamboozled heavily relies on this motif.
Show.
The disturbing minstrel show itself has the cast entering through a prop door shaped like the gaping mouth of a smiling Sambo. Maybe it stems from the general cinematic fascination with the evil clown trope. There's the painted faces, the artificial displays of emotion, both of which come with the standard fear of clowns, and minstrelsy certainly has historical ties to modern clowning in the tramp tradition. And for an excellent look at that, please check out a couple videos from the channel Danny Funk in the description. And it might be over here. I don't have fingers. It's on the screen somewhere. It might be reasonable to conclude that minstrel demons represent a different flavor of evil clown, and the psychological fear behind blackface relates to a general fear of clowns. But beyond even this level, the projection of a corrupted or false self reflects an experience of blackface minstrelsy that specifically resonates with black viewers. When the minstrel show enters the horror space, it amplifies the most scarring dimensions of that practice, the insulting misrepresentation, and the uncanny horror of losing agency over your own image. Bamboozled isn't a straight up horror movie, but clearly doesn't shy from being dark or creepy. Besides that little minstrel bank, Lee develops a cinematic tension that tightens its grip on the narrative, peaking in an explosively violent finale, and the film fades to credits on a haunting final note. Our main characters, figuratively back from the dead, smile and laugh maniacally, smothering the audience in irony in the wake of a tragic ending. The same irony carried through to the bank as its smile mocks De La in his lowest moments. And the giant painted smile disguises a gateway to a hellish world of the minstrel stage. Television churns the black artists behind the show through the machine of capital and spectacle, and out pop these possessed automatons doing the dirty work of a racist network and irresponsible creators. The stars get swallowed up by the burnt cork as they're repeatedly asked to literally paint on smiles while their personal lives fall apart. Not for the art, but for the paycheck, a ticket out of homelessness. Despite all their champagne dreams, the power of media reduces them to consumable entertainment products. They're no more in control of their situation than the racist ephemera that furnishes De La's office. The episode of Lovecraft Country that focuses on the main character's cousin Dee finds her at a solemn point that no child should have to go through. Dee deals with the traumatic reality of not only her friend's death, but his bloated, smelly corpse. She harbors the pain that her friend was brutally murdered and didn't get to grow up with her because of the violent racism endemic to American society. We see her pain transformed into bright anger, anger that is justified, anger that is righteous even. But little black girls don't always get to be righteously angry. When ignored black children lash out, how are they usually seen? Honestly, does our society offer up compassion at every turn? Or are they seen more like little monsters who need to be confined and feared? Topsy and Bopsy are meant to be dark reflections of Dee, who she could become, how the world could see her, reduce her. And that image stalks her as she tries to get anyone to care about her situation. She musters the courage to fight back. But as they finally catch her, they weren't merely interested in killing or disemboweling her like most modern horror monsters prefer. The Pickaninny demons infect her, nearly transforming her into one of them. The metaphor of the minstrel demon here motions towards misogynoir, the particular oppressions that lie at the intersection of womanhood and blackness. The transformation into a smiling pickaninny in a moment of great tragedy reflects a pressure for black girls particularly to avoid expressing anger or making others uncomfortable, to instead be nice, to smile, despite the horror going on all around them. And we see Dee almost succumb to it. Her body writhes and morphs on the bed in an obvious nod to the 1970s Exorcist, a film partly about the horrors of innocent loss, the corruption of something pure into something profane. Dee nearly loses herself as she's possessed by a loathsome image she never conjured for herself, unlike the comic she draws from her vivid imagination.
A Cynthia blue? Oh, Pumpkin, we decided to change it. It's no big deal, Ma.
In Them, the tap dance man first comes to the Emorys after a moment of subtle racism. He appears as a black man in the exaggerated makeup of traditional blackface, as some black actors did do in the height of minstrelsy's popularity, simply to get work. He immediately transfixes the father and proceeds to sink his gloved claws in as the Emory family falls deeper into the horrors of their new home. While I can appreciate where they were trying to go with this character, his impact and underlying meaning is handled kind of sloppily or inconsistently. As a symbol, the tap dance man clearly burlesques the father's feelings of marginalization. His literal shuck and jive embodies the pressure to play the game of corporate America as a black man, to perform the role of non-threatening subservient worker who's just grateful to be there, to merely smile politely in response to the many indignities he faces. As a character, the tap dance man's goal progresses to encouraging the father towards violence as a way to destroy the family from the inside out, to make him evil. But a lot of the violence the father projects is reactive to the immediate danger inflicted by their hostile neighbors. Like, is it evil to defend your family with violence when met with violence? The tap dance man picks at the festering wounds of racial resentment, goading the father into brutal violence, self-hatred, and self-destruction. Yet, only his bloody defeat reveals the tap dance man's true identity, a white imposter and a grotesque counterfeit of blackness in black makeup. Like Lovecraft Country, Them similarly attempts to literalize the impact of mischaracterization in blackface minstrelsy. The tap dance man turns the father into a raging mass of fury, in contrast to the distinguished, upstanding black man we see at the beginning of the show. The message being that, in the words of James Baldwin, the father ultimately does not succumb to believing what the white world says about him.
And you ain't never gonna be me.
The smiling gollywog provides a comforting caricature, a fabrication meant to take the form of real people that nevertheless informs how others view those same people. In the Good Golly segment of Tales from the Hood 2, the kinda goofy twist of the doll coming to life is meant to reveal the truth of it, taking a dehumanizing stereotype to a monstrous conclusion.
This poor, misshapen creature was given life by a white English woman and nurtured on the tit of racism, a foul aberration that refuses to die as new generations resuscitate its tortured soul.
These stories express some of the ways moving through a racist society can transform you, take you out your character, or fashion you into a figure of someone else's twisted imagination, and how stereotypical images will try to possess you, do things in your name. These works also clock the negative images as originating from popular media production. The Pickaninny image that ends up haunting Dee is a fiction she first encounters from a very popular book, Uncle Tom's Cabin. Notably, the scene uses literature in tandem with radio as another popular site of counterfeit black media production. This horror remix of an old minstrel song plays prominently in the scenes where Dee gets chased, working kinda like the Jason Voorhees whispers or the dreading piano that works as the harbinger of Michael Myers or Jaws. The radio specifically draws our attention by completely disrupting the diegesis, first starting as music that Dee hears herself, then bleeding into the overall soundtrack.
It doesn't mean you have to give it to him easy.
Stop that knocking, stop that knocking, stop that knocking, stop that knocking. You had better stop that knocking at the door. Let me in.
Music and radio as a device is pretty on point here. I'm thinking of Pat Boone's flaccid, whitewashed covers of iconic Little Richard songs that ended up making that bum a lot more money than the black person who created it. The juxtaposition highlights this red thread connecting music history and blackface minstrelsy. That is, a mystifying desire for black art without black people. And it's fitting that the tap dance man's Zip Coon type figure first appears in a TV shop. He's an image on display, a creation of media. Tales from the Hood 2, although somewhat clunkily, makes this point explicit. After the sadistic curator does his work and delivers the litter of gollywog babies, he practically talks right to the audience saying,
"F***ing white women and having babies. But how dare they call you a stereotype? You're just the creation they designed you to be."
The Gollywog doll is a figment of how a racist culture portrayed it to be, whether that be the original dehumanizing children's books or the lineage of haunted dolls. Popular media is powerful, and the images it proliferates can have lasting effects on culture. From books to film to television, the audience of spectators can also be the intended target of a haunting. What little pieces of itself that media leaves behind in your mind. De La, who maligns TV as the idiot box, learns to appreciate its power by the end of Bamboozled when he finally watches a tape his assistant Sloan wanted him to watch, although his come to TV Jesus moment is entirely too late. At the end of that film, we too are left watching a montage of blackface minstrelsy images captured on film throughout history. I remember watching this film late at night as a high schooler, and I was confused, stunned. I had never seen most of these images. I was mad at the culture, especially Bugs Bunny. Like, after all the Hood did for him in the Looney Tunes, seeing these images repeated one after the other and experiencing a kind of totality of all of these images that culture birthed was overwhelming, and honestly, it creeped me the hell out.
The hell are you smiling at?
It's disturbing to see people corrupt something beloved and precious. To see groups taking what belongs to black culture, our dances, our musicality, our magic, and twisting it and contorting it to fit the facsimile of it for profit. Sometimes even making shit up and wrapping it in faux black folksiness, which was a lot of minstrelsy. Eric Lott refers to this as the counterfeit and currency of blackface minstrelsy. This theft, possession, and transformation of identity was tangible in specific, real-life examples. You could see it in the irony of how J.W. McAndrews' Watermelon Man skit of a blackface street vendor made more money than the actual man selling watermelon on the street. Or when black Shakespearean actors of the 1820s like Ira Aldridge and James Hewlett were so consistently lampooned that audiences wanted to see the serious actors incorporate bits from the minstrel routines that openly mocked them. Don't get it twisted. Ira Aldridge outright rejected these portrayals in several articles and publications. James Hewlett, Aldridge's mentor and fellow actor of the African Theater Company in New York City, was also not amused by the racist jokes. He wrote a direct response to one of those white performers and writers named Charles Matthews in an open letter, and he said it straight like this. "I lament to say you have given me cause of complaint. We were all unmercifully handled and mangled in your new entertainment. You have ridiculed our African theater in Mercer Street and burlesqued me with the rest of our Negro actors, as you are pleased to call us, mimicked our styles, imitated our dialects, laughed at our anomalies, and lampooned, oh shame, even our complexions." Or in other words, Hewlett continued, "Our immortal bard, and he is our bard as well as yours, makes sweet Desdemona say, 'I saw Othello's visage in his mind.' Now, when you were ridiculing the quote-unquote chief black tragedian and burlesquing the quote real Negro melody, was it my mind or my visage which should have made an impression on you?"
Get her, Jay.
Great. Now, can we please retire this "it was acceptable at the time" discourse? As you can see, black people existed at the time, and let me tell you, they didn't accept it. To bring it all full circle, T.D. Rice himself would go on to incorporate references to both Hewlett and Aldridge in his Jim Crow acts. He tried to skewer their careers with bits like Jim Crow telling the story of Hamlet, who he'd call, of course, Massa Hamlet. He even threw in some shade toward their personal troubles, including when James Hewlett was harassed and arrested. Some scholars argue that Hewlett in time became a casualty of Jim Crow, who was kind of a haunted version of himself. Those parodies of blackness rose in popularity. Meanwhile, Hewlett's authentic black star faded, and he's seldom remembered, in contrast to the immortalized symbol of segregation. Hewlett's image was doomed, butchered by a smiling shadow who stole his likeness. The figure of a black artist possessed by the original minstrel demon. How's that for a ghost story? Minstrel horror brings to life some feelings that may take too many words to describe, or a whole insert running time long video essay. A feeling that despite knowing yourself, people can look past you and only interact with the image of you crafted by someone else. This is the terror that's implied in Du Bois' concept of double consciousness. The feeling of having your selfhood wrested from your control. The fear that if the image sticks to you without your consent, that you'll still just become the monster. That you might actually start to believe you are ugly, that your mannerisms are ridiculous, that you're happy being down or less than, that you're a menace to society, that all you're good for is singing so beautifully and dancing so wonderfully that white people will want to see other white people do the same things. The terror lies in the image's power to consume a person. This image of us that is not us. An maddening feeling of having a persona forced upon you. When you start picking apart the image of a black person, probing her body, extracting her mannerisms for derision and humor, you perform a sinister type of dissection that might entertain the likes of Hannibal Lecter or Leatherface. And when you put her back together, what have you created? A Frankenstein monster of a grotesque caricature. A human who awakes to a Kafkaesque nightmare to find himself transformed into a loathsome creature, whether by irony or dark magic or just the everyday realities of dealing with racist bullshit. A disfigured dark symbol of antipathy fit to sell syrup and cream of wheat. If people want to use art to depict those powerful forces, that kind of transformation, along with showing a united struggle against them, struggle that even ends in triumph, well, that just might make for a decent story. Hey y'all, hope you're liking the video so far. Before I finish out with this last bit, I wanted to let you know, in case you didn't know, that GoldFro has a Patreon. Fans of the channel can tip on over to patreon.com/GoldFro and become a member to support what I do here. I'll basically be using this as a blog for extended thoughts on video topics, behind the scenes stuff, and granted early access to future content. I also have a video discussing the film Beasts of the Southern Wild that is unfortunately no longer available on YouTube, but it will be up on patreon.com/GoldFro at the lowest tier. The fact that y'all are watching and sharing and joining the conversation on YouTube honestly means a lot to me. So if yet another paid subscription is just not the tea for you, I'll just ask that you keep liking and sharing and commenting. Honestly, that would do me a solid, and I appreciate y'all so much. All right, let's wrap this drawing up.
What you gonna do? What you gonna do? What you gonna do?
Very funny!
I understand why people want to avoid this topic, or don't want to see more black suffering, or don't think it should be made entertainment just on GP, like as a moral judgment. Fair enough. At the same time, if we have a subject that is so feared, has so much anxiety around it that we want to bury it, never talk about it, turn away from it, outrun it by putting it behind us, and prosecute people for teaching what happened, as a student of horror storytelling, that sounds like fertile ground for horror stories. When your main goal is scaring your audience, they may push you to tread in the uncomfortable, the taboo, whatever might be the most transgressive to society. In that way, horror is known to push boundaries, and some of the most exciting, provocative horror cinema dangles precariously on the edge of good and bad taste. However, like a lot of worthwhile artistic pursuits, there are risks. You kind of need to know what you're doing because, like Bamboozled explores, things can go horribly wrong.
Nasty daddy.
Like, you need some couth if you're gonna do this, because these stories can be powerful. They have an effect on people. They, in some ways, have a life of their own. Anytime you go to the well of black trauma for inspiration for your art, you're taking a big risk with your audience. Assuming a decent portion of your audience is black people, a question that is one of the big criticisms of them, like, who exactly was that show for? Little Marvin, the creator of Them, seemed to have good intentions in telling the story in the way he wanted to, but even good intentions can sometimes fall short with audiences, clearly. And I'm not just throwing that criticism out there, I'm speaking from experience as someone who has put those kinds of themes in my own filmmaking, specifically in the horror genre. I'm just saying, I understand firsthand that it is a tricky balance. And I don't mean to disparage any filmmaker for trying, or even for trying and falling a little short. Even though the media I covered in this video contains some things I did not care for, I think there are still some poignant takeaways from them. I know this is a conclusion, but I still got some analysis left, so here we go. I think it's also good to note that the characters aren't merely brutalized. In 2 of the 3 examples I looked at, they actually win in the end, at least to some degree. In Them, Livia Emery blazes through a house of fear and phantasm to rescue her family from their tormentors. She resolves some deep trauma, regaining her strength and knowledge of self, which propels her and gives her the clarity to see through the fog of false visions from a bunch of racist ghosts. Then the family is able to see the tap dance man for who he truly is, and her husband Henry is freed. Dee's family digs through mountains of intergenerational trauma and literally travels through time to one of the most notoriously violent nights in US history to find a cure. Through magic and metaphysics, they reconnect with ancestors to reclaim a powerful heritage, essentially reestablishing a foundation of identity, an origin rooted in power and self-love, not self-loathing. The thread of self-actualization carries through as Dee recovers and becomes the sci-fi badass of her escapist fantasies. Watching these films and shows, we see the transformation and its potential to destroy a person, but Henry and Dee manage to overcome. Through the love of family and community, they reclaim themselves. They take back their body and mind. They reassert their own self-image, their own identities, and tear down the false one. I'm not sure how satisfying it feels when the work is done. I can't help but feel that even though their personal terror ends, the evil is still out there in some form. Maybe this is a repeatable ritual. Family and community coming together to lift each other up, become each other's saviors, become each other's hope. A fantastical dream to combat the nightmare. But if I'm being honest, I don't know how many more Jigaboo demons I can really handle. I feel like I might cap out at like 1 or 2 more. So let's make them count. Who knows? American Horror Story Minstrel Show might be it in a little bit. I'm kidding. That was a joke. Please don't do that. Ryan Murphy, a finger of warning to you, sis. But seriously, despite most people's apprehension, which I totally understand, I'm inclined to see blackface minstrelsy and all that comes with it as valid source material to explore through horror. Why not? This is a horrifying image on many levels, as I hope this video makes clear. The history conjures up all the mockery, obsession, fear, and loathing stewing within generations of anti-blackness, feelings that hideously remain present and relevant still today. But so does our powerful persistence to exorcise those demons, deflect those unrepresentative images from our sense of self in order to just live our lives. How radical is that? And until all that work is no longer necessary, I guess we'll keep seeing artistic representations of what still haunts us. Maybe a little humor wouldn't hurt.
No, thank you.
The blackening?
Whoa! Jim Crow Monopoly.
Shit probably runs on racism.
I will spare your lives if you sacrifice the person you deem the blackest.
The blackest?
Shanika, she say nigga the most.
Nigga.
See?
Minstrelsy does scare me. The scariest part is the dehumanization, what it opens the doors to express, what it says about the culture I was born into, the gory juxtaposition of the smiling image and the violence it was birthed out of. I can't help but think of the carnage happening at the same time, the theft, captivity, and depravity of antebellum, the terrorism of the Klan, the murderous apathy of the government, the targeted police violence, down to the sham justice system that just sweeps undesirables under the rug. Yet from the playful image of the minstrel, you wouldn't tell a thing was wrong. Everyone just enjoys the show. The lights go down and you don't see the horror. Only entertainment and a bloody smile in the dark. Spooky. Thank you to everybody who was along for this journey. Special shout out to Big Sis for reading that quote like a pro and for all your help during the very long process. And of course, thank you to my very first patron, Sam. You did your big one. Thank you for helping support this project. Please take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and keep your head up. All right? Peace.
Boo.